It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the small town of Flaxborough, and the local flower show was underway. The village hall, decked out with garlands of ivy and chrysanthemums, had attracted the usual crowd, the long-serving members of the Flaxborough Horticultural Society, the curious onlookers from neighbouring villages, and of course the inevitable local busybodies. Mrs. Felton, the society's most enthusiastic member, hovered near the prize roses, nodding in approval at the few flowers, worthy of her exacting standards, all the while gossiping about the weather, the state of the council's budget, and most notably the latest fuss over the forthcoming railway reorganisation. In the midst of this picture of suburban tranquillity, the mild-mannered and ever-polite Inspector Purbright stood at the back of the room, leaning against a wooden pillar, his hands tucked neatly behind his back. He had no particular interest in flowers, but he was intrigued by the dynamics of the crowd, the way Mrs. Felton's voice raised an octave when talking about Mr. Lancaster's dahlias, or how Mr. Morrow, the retired schoolmaster, always seemed to circle a specific arrangement, as though he were inspecting the arrangement for faults. Then, in the far corner of the room, something odd caught his eye. A girl, no older than 20, was standing alone by a table filled with a variety of wines. A section that had been set up for a charity auction, no less. She was gazing not at the bottles, nor the auctioned glasses, but at something that seemed far more interesting. A modest gravestone sitting, inexplicably, near the entrance of the hall. The headstone, old and weathered, had been brought in as part of an antique display. To the casual observer, it seemed like nothing more than an odd choice of decor, but to the girl, it appeared as though it held some strange fascination. She was tall, with long dark hair that fell carelessly over her shoulders. Her face, framed by the strands, was pale and her expression vacant, as though lost in thought. It was as though she were in conversation with the stone itself, her lips moving silently, her fingers lightly brushing its rough surface. A glass of red wine, half filled and held loosely in her hand, had almost forgotten its purpose in her absent grip. As the minutes ticked by, a few of the local residents, who had been busy with their usual small talk, started to notice the girl. Mrs. Felton, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, glanced toward her and immediately started whispering into the ear of Mr. Lancaster. "Who is she, do you suppose?" Mrs. Felton asked in a voice that was just loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "I don't remember seeing her around here before." "Can't say I do," Mr. Lancaster replied, eyeing the girl with the same curiosity. "Looks a bit out of place, doesn't she?" Before Mrs. Felton could respond, the girl took a step back from the headstone, her lips still moving silently, then turned to face the crowd. For a moment she looked almost startled, as though realizing she had an audience. Her eyes, large and dark, scanned the room before her gaze fixed on the wine table. Just as quietly, she made her way towards the table and poured herself another glass of wine. She drank slowly, eyes still fixed on the gravestone, as though there were no one else in the room. And then, just as quietly as she had arrived, she walked back toward the exit, leaving behind her empty glass on the counter. The room was still for a moment. People glanced at one another, eyes shifting uncomfortably. Someone muttered something about the girl being a bit odd, and a few exchanged knowing glances. But nothing more was said, except of course for Mrs. Felton, who, once again, could not resist the temptation to engage in her favorite pastime, gossip. "That girl," she said, her voice loud enough to be overheard. "She's the daughter of Mrs. Griffiths from the old house on the hill. I've heard all sorts of things about that family, and none of it good. It's a shame, really. They've been in this town for years, but lately, well, who knows what kind of trouble they've been causing." The conversation fizzled out as quickly as it had begun, with only the faintest trace of unease lingering in the air. The townspeople returned to their more familiar concerns, arranging flowers, admiring ribbons, and discussing the state of their gardens. But for Inspector Purbright, the quiet scene had stirred something deeper within. He had already taken note of the girl's peculiar behavior. She had moved like someone who didn't quite belong. The way she lingered by the gravestone, a silent conversation perhaps, and the way she drank wine without the usual pleasantries, without acknowledging anyone, was enough to draw his attention. It was as if she had placed herself above the small-town drama, Yet something about her made him wonder whether there was more to her presence than met the eye. And then, as if on cue, another ripple in the tranquil waters of Flaxborough occurred. The sound of a distant scream echoed from outside the hall. The crowd froze. Mrs. Felton's mouth dropped open as the sound reached their ears. Some looked toward the door, others exchanged confused glances. Purbright's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted. The quiet orderliness of the flower show, it seemed, had been disturbed. He set his cup of tea down carefully, adjusted his coat, and made his way toward the door. The small town, it seemed, had more to reveal than its flowery facade suggested. And the girl, the one who had drunk wine with the dead, was just the first piece of the puzzle. Inspector Purbright stepped out of the village hall, his polished shoes making soft, methodical taps against the worn stone path. The small crowd that had gathered inside had already begun murmuring among themselves, their voices raised in quiet speculation. Something about the scream had unnerved them, but they didn't yet know whether it was a false alarm or something far more sinister. Purbright's gaze swept over the town square, scanning the familiar buildings for any sign of commotion. The scream had come from the direction of the old churchyard on the edge of town. It wasn't an area many people ventured to during the day, but the church was one of Flaxborough's oldest buildings, and there was a certain charm to the place when the sun cast its soft light through the stained glass windows. The scream, however, suggested that something more troubling had taken place there than the usual village gossip or the occasional runaway cat. Purbright's steps quickened, though his pace remained steady, measured. It wasn't long before he reached the churchyard gate, which creaked as he pushed it open. The cemetery itself was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves caught in the wind. A small group of people had gathered near the church's stone steps, all of them looking uneasy and whispering fervently amongst themselves. Standing apart from the rest was the girl. She was still holding her wineglass, though now it was empty. Her gaze was fixed on something just beyond the group, her face still pale, almost ghostly in the dimming light. She hadn't spoken since she'd left the flower show, and now standing. Here her silence seemed even more pronounced. She stood rigid as though frozen in place, yet there was an air of expectation about her. Purbright approached the group, his presence calm but authoritative. He didn't immediately ask any questions, instead simply observing the scene. The people who had gathered were all local, and their discomfort was palpable. Mrs. Felton, naturally, was at the center of the group, her wide eyes darting from one person to the next as she tried to make sense of what had happened. I didn't see anything," said one of the women, her hands wringing the hem of her coat. "But it came from over there by the tombstones, and I thought I saw something moving." "Probably just a bird or a fox," another man said quickly, though his voice was laced with doubt. "Not a scream. Not like that." Purbright waited, letting the chatter subside before speaking. "What exactly did you hear?" His voice was polite, almost gentle, but there was a sharpness to it that commanded attention. The woman who had spoken first, Mrs. Felton's neighbor, gave a nervous glance towards the girl, who had not moved since they arrived. "It sounded like a person in distress," she said hesitantly, "but it was muffled, almost as if someone was, holding their breath while they screamed. It didn't last long, just a few seconds." Purbright glanced toward the girl, once again. Her expression remained distant, her lips slightly parted as if still listening to something only she could hear. "And the girl?" he asked casually. "Did anyone see her here before?" Mrs. Felton was quick to answer, though she didn't seem to fully understand the question. Yes, she was at the flower show earlier, just standing by that old gravestone, you know, talking to it or looking at it. I don't know what she was doing, but she's definitely not from around here." Purbright nodded, processing the information. The girl's odd behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and his instincts told him that there was something more to her presence in Flaxborough than a passing curiosity about an old churchyard. The scream, too, had unsettled him. It wasn't simply a sound of fear, but one of pain, anguish perhaps, something desperate. "I'd like to speak with her," Purbright said quietly. His tone brooked no argument. The crowd parted as he made his way toward the girl, who, despite the bustle around her, hadn't moved a muscle. He stood a few paces away, allowing the girl a moment of silence before speaking. "Miss?" Purbright's voice was calm, measured. "Are you all right?" The girl blinked as if roused from a trance, her dark eyes focusing on him. For a moment, she said nothing, merely staring at him. It was a long, uncomfortable silence, then finally she spoke, her voice soft and distant. "There was a man," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "He was talking to me, but he's gone now." Purbright's eyes narrowed, though his expression remained composed. "What man?" he asked, his voice neutral. The girl's lips parted again, as if struggling to recall something important. "He was old and he wanted me to listen. He said the dead have stories and they need someone to tell them." Purbright's brow furrowed slightly. Her words were cryptic, and the more she spoke, the more his intuition told him that her connection to the scene might not be coincidental. "And what happened then?" She looked away, her gaze drifting back to the gravestones, as if something invisible was pulling her attention back to them. "I don't know, I couldn't stay, it felt wrong." Purbright glanced toward the gathering crowd, but no one had moved to approach the girl. They were all watching from a distance, hesitant to involve themselves further. He sighed softly. The girl was clearly in some distress, but her odd, almost prophetic statements only seemed to complicate matters. The scream, her behavior, and her cryptic remarks were all tangled in a web that needed to be untangled carefully. "Miss," Purbright said, his voice firm yet gentle, "I need you to come with me for a moment. I need to ask you a few questions about what you've seen." She didn't protest, but merely nodded, her face still pale. Purbright could see that something in her had broken, perhaps temporarily, perhaps permanently. But there was more to this situation than a mere moment of hysteria. As they walked toward the church, Purbright's mind was already working through the puzzle. The girl, her strange remarks, and the scream all tied together in a way that hinted at something deeper. A buried truth, hidden beneath the surface of Flaxborough's tranquil existence, and Purbright knew that the town's carefully curated facade was about to be cracked wide open. As they approached the old church, the fading light of the late afternoon cast long shadows across the uneven cobblestones. The girl, still holding her empty wineglass with a detached grace, walked beside Purbright without a word. Her eyes were fixed forward, distant and unfocused, as though she were seeing something beyond the tangible world around her. Purbright kept a steady pace, his mind sifting through the details he had observed so far. The scream, the girl's cryptic words, the unsettling stillness in her movements, all of it painted a picture that felt at once both strange and familiar. He had seen such things before, the kind of peculiar behavior that could be explained away by the simple, everyday dramas of small-town life. But something in his gut told him this was different. The churchyard was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the trees and the occasional coo of a pigeon perched atop a gravestone. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decaying flowers, an atmosphere that felt both peaceful and unsettling. Purbright led the girl to the small wooden bench near the church door, where he motioned for her to sit. She complied without hesitation, as though she had no real sense of where she was or what she was doing. "Miss, I need you to tell me more about what happened," Purbright said, his voice steady, though there was an unmistakable edge of concern in his tone. He stood before her, hands folded neatly behind his back, waiting for her to speak. The girl's eyes slowly shifted up to meet his, but there was no real focus in her gaze, only the same distant look she had worn since arriving at the churchyard. "The man, he was standing near the oldest grave. He was old too, with thin white hair. I don't know how to explain it, but his eyes weren't right. Not human, almost." She paused as though gathering the strength to continue. "He said something about the wine. He told me it was for the dead." Purbright leaned in slightly, his attention sharpening. "The wine?" he repeated. "Yes," she nodded, her voice now wavering slightly. "He said that the dead, they need to drink too so they can tell their stories. He wanted me to stay and listen." There was a long silence as Purbright processed her words. Her description of the man was vague, but it wasn't the first time he'd heard of someone who seemed to step outside the boundaries of reality. It was possible she had been drinking too much wine herself, or perhaps had been overcome by the atmosphere of the evening. But that nagging feeling, an unease, a hunch, lingered. There was more to this than mere eccentricity. Purbright knelt in front of her, his gaze level. "Do you remember what he said exactly? Any words that stand out?" The girl seemed to drift further into thought, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her glass. "He said, the stories are trapped, that the dead can't speak unless someone listens. They need someone to tell them. And then he gave me the wine." "Was there anything else?" Purbright pressed, his tone gentle but insistent. She shook her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "No, it's all fuzzy now. I felt strange. Like I was trapped too. Like something inside me wanted to stay, but something else told me to leave." Purbright stood up slowly, considering her words carefully. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she spoke, as though she had been touched by something beyond her control. He had seen it before, people caught up in their own emotions, their own misperceptions, but there was something here, an undercurrent of unease that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Miss," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I need you to focus for a moment. Can you remember where this man went after you left the grave?" She blinked, and for the first time there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. He went to the old tombstone, the one with the cracked face. He didn't look back. And then I heard the scream." Purbright's heart skipped a beat. The scream. He hadn't connected the two details before, but now it seemed clear. The scream had been a warning, a sign that something was terribly wrong, something that connected the girl, the old man, and whatever had transpired in this churchyard. But there were still too many unknowns. The connection was there, but it was a thread that needed to be pulled slowly, carefully. "Stay here for a moment," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I need to have a look around." He turned and walked toward the church entrance, his steps deliberate. The old door creaked open as he pushed it, the interior dark and musty. The church smelled faintly of incense and old wood, a quiet, sacred place that seemed worlds away from the strangeness of the outside world. Purbright moved toward the altar, his eyes scanning the pews, the stone floors, and the faded banners hanging from the rafters. There was nothing unusual at first glance. The church, despite its age, appeared untouched by time. But there was a nagging sensation that something had shifted in the air. He made his way toward the back of the church, where a narrow door led to the small vestry. It was there, amidst the dust and clutter, that his eyes caught something unexpected. A small silver flask tucked behind a pile of old hymnals. The flask was unmarked, plain, but there was something about it that immediately drew his attention. He reached down and picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver up his spine. As he turned the flask over in his hand, the door to the church creaked behind him. He glanced up to find the girl standing in the doorway, her expression uncertain, but drawn to him. She had followed him without making a sound. I remembered something," she said, her voice thin. "The man, he was carrying something, a small bottle like the one you're holding." Purbright's eyes flicked back to the flask. "What did he do with it?" he asked, his tone steady but laced with urgency. The girl hesitated, her face pale. He said it was the key to open the door. He wanted me to drink it, but I couldn't." Purbright placed the flask carefully into his coat pocket, his mind racing. The girl's words were becoming more coherent, but they raised more questions than they answered. What door? And why had the man given her the wine? The answer was elusive, but Purbright knew this was a significant clue. The flask, the man's strange behavior, and the girl's cryptic statements were all part of something much larger. It was a puzzle, and Purbright would need to piece it together carefully. He turned back toward the girl, who was now standing, silently in the doorway, her face still drawn but slightly more composed than before. He could sense that she was teetering on the edge of something, her mind on the brink of either breaking or coming to some kind of understanding. "We'll need to go back to the flower show," Purbright said quietly, his voice reassuring, yet commanding. "There's more to this, and I'm going to need your help." She nodded slowly, as though she understood that the weight of the situation was shifting. Together they would return to the village, where the next piece of the puzzle waited to be uncovered. But Purbright knew that the truth was never as simple as it appeared on the surface. And in Flaxborough, as in every small town, there were Always more secrets hidden beneath the calm exterior than anyone cared to admit. They returned to the flower show in silence, the faint glow of dusk casting long shadows across the cobbled streets of Flaxborough. The girl, who had remained eerily still on the bench for what seemed like an eternity, now walked beside Purbright with a slightly more resolute air. Her earlier dazed expression had given way to one of quiet contemplation, though the haunted look in her eyes remained. Something had shifted in her, though Purbright couldn't yet tell what it was. He had seen it before, people touched by something they couldn't explain, teetering on the brink of revelation or madness. As they approached the village hall, Purbright's mind was filled with the fragments of the puzzle. The scream, the whine, the old man, and the cryptic phrases that had escaped the girl's lips. They were all tied together, but he could feel that there was something just beyond his reach, something he hadn't seen yet. It was like watching a complex machine with one cog missing, and the pieces had yet to fall into place. The hall was still bustling with people, their conversations picking up again as they milled about, assessing flowers, exchanging polite pleasantries, and ignoring the undercurrents of unease that seemed to have settled over the town. Mrs. Felton, as always, was at the heart of things, her voice rising above the others as she passed judgment on an arrangement of marigolds. She didn't notice the girl immediately, but as she caught sight of Purbright and his companion, her sharp eyes narrowed in scrutiny. Purbright gave a polite nod to Mrs. Felton, but he didn't allow her to engage in her usual round of gossip. He had work to do, and right now Mrs. Felton's observations would have to wait. "Miss," Purbright said quietly, turning to the girl, "I need you to stay here for a moment. There's something I need to check inside." She nodded wordlessly, still clutching the empty wine glass as though it were a lifeline. As he moved toward the hall's entrance, his thoughts remained fixed on the cryptic words she had spoken earlier. The man, the wine, the door, the key. He was certain there was something symbolic in all of it. But where was the link? What had the man meant by the key? And why had he singled out the girl? Inside, the flower show had resumed its gentle rhythm. People moved between tables, commenting on blooms, exclaiming over the colors and admiring the delicate arrangements. The air was filled with the soft hum of polite conversation, the humdrum of village life, yet something felt off. It wasn't just the lingering discomfort from the scream earlier, or the strange conversation Purbright had overheard. It was the sense that something important had been overlooked, buried beneath the surface of these ordinary interactions. Purbright moved through the hall, his eyes scanning the crowd. His mind was still on the girl's words, but he also knew he had to dig deeper into the strange events of the day. He made his way to the area where the auctioned wine bottles had been set up, hoping that something might have been overlooked. The scent of the wine still hung faintly in the air, mixing with the heavy perfume of flowers and the musty scent of old wood. As he approached the table, something caught his eye. A slip of paper, folded neatly and tucked beneath one of the empty wine bottles, barely visible. Purbright's fingers hovered over it before he slid it out carefully, unfolding it with the precision of a man used to handling delicate matters. The note was simple, written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. There were no words, only a single cryptic drawing, an old key, a circle, and beneath it a small jagged line. The key was unmistakable, its shape odd and irregular, as though drawn by someone who didn't quite know what they were depicting. It felt like a message, something that had been placed there on purpose, meant to be found by the right person. Purbright's pulse quickened. The key, the same symbol the girl had mentioned. But what was the circle? And what did the jagged line signify? Purbright stood for a moment, his mind racing. The girl's strange encounter with the old man was beginning to make more sense, but the pieces were still scattered. He had to know more. He couldn't afford to let the trail go cold now. He slipped the note into his coat pocket, his eyes scanning the room once again. Mrs. Felton was still gossiping with Mr. Lancaster, but there was something different about the way they spoke now, their voices lower, more conspiratorial. And at the far side of the room, the elderly Mr. Morrow was standing by the window, looking out with a far-off expression, his hands clasped behind his back. He seemed out of place among the crowd of flower enthusiasts, his posture too rigid. too watchful. Purbright's instincts told him that the old schoolmaster knew more than he was letting on. And in a town like Flaxborough, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, it wasn't a stretch to think that Mr. Morrow might have had his hand in something more unusual than flower arrangements. He made his way toward the window, his footsteps quiet on the creaky floorboards. As he approached, Mr. Morrow turned slightly, his gaze briefly meeting Purbright's before he quickly looked away. There was no recognition in his eyes, no surprise that the inspector had approached him. It was as if Purbright had been expected. "Mr. Morrow," Purbright said smoothly, his voice polite but direct, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." The old man turned fully toward him, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his round spectacles. "Of course, Inspector," he said, his voice thin and reedy. "What can I help you with?" "I understand you've been a long-time resident of Flaxborough," Purbright said, keeping his tone even, "and that you might have some knowledge of the history of this town, more specifically, of the old churchyard." Mr. Morrow's face twitched at the mention of the church, a barely perceptible shift in his demeanor. He cleared his throat before answering, his voice a little lower than before. "The churchyard?" he repeated, his gaze flicking toward the windows. "A place of old bones, Inspector. Nothing but that. Why would you be interested in such a place?" Purbright smiled, though it was a thin, calculating smile. "There are certain things that interest me, Mr. Morrow, and some of those things are linked to the past, a past that is far from forgotten." Mr. Morrow stiffened, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But Purbright was already prepared. He wasn't about to let this slip away so easily. "You see," Purbright continued, his voice low, "there's been talk of an old man in the churchyard today, and some strange occurrences. Perhaps you might know more about them?" The older man's face went pale, and for the first time Purbright saw a crack in the stoic exterior. Mr. Morrow cleared his throat again, his lips pressing together into a thin line. I'm afraid I know nothing about such things," Mr. Morrow muttered, his voice growing more unsteady. "The churchyard is a place of memories, best left undisturbed." Purbright studied him closely, noting the tension in his posture. There was something Mr. Morrow wasn't telling him, something he was desperately trying to keep hidden, and Purbright knew that the man's involvement in whatever had transpired in the churchyard was far from coincidental. "I see," Purbright said quietly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "But I'm not asking about memories, Mr. Morrow. I'm asking about the present, and I believe you know exactly what I'm talking about." For a long moment Mr. Morrow didn't respond. His eyes flicked around the room again, then slowly returned to Purbright's gaze, filled with a quiet, reluctant understanding. Purbright waited, his patience unwavering. The old man's confession was coming, one way or another. "Fine," Mr. Morrow finally muttered, his shoulders sagging as though a great weight had been lifted. "You're right. I know more than I should. But I can't explain it all. Not yet." Purbright didn't press him further. There would be time for that. For now the puzzle was beginning to take shape. The pieces were aligning, and Flaxborough's secrets were starting to come to the surface. The tension in the air was thick as Purbright stood in front of Mr. Morrow, waiting for the old man to gather his thoughts. The room around them continued to bustle with the innocent chatter of the flower show, but Purbright's mind was no longer with the event. It was consumed by the unfolding puzzle. Mr. Morrow's reluctance was palpable, but Purbright could see it now. There was a fear in the older man's eyes, a hesitation that was rare in someone so accustomed to the quiet life of Flaxborough. Something had shaken him, something deep and unsettling. Purbright stood in silence, giving Morrow the space to speak. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but the words Purbright needed still hung in the air, waiting for the right moment to be uttered. Finally, Mr. Morrow spoke, his voice low and strained, as though the words were scraping from the bottom of his throat. "It's not just a churchyard. You don't understand what's buried there." Purbright's heart quickened. He hadn't been expecting such a direct admission, but the gravity in Morrow's voice confirmed what he'd suspected all along. The town's secrets were more deeply rooted than anyone could imagine. "What do you mean?" Purbright asked, his voice calm, his eyes steady on the man. "What's buried there?" Morrow shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Not just bones, Inspector. Something more. Something that shouldn't be disturbed. Purbright leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. What exactly are you saying, Mr. Morrow? The old man's eyes darted toward the door and then quickly back to Purbright. He seemed to weigh the decision of whether to speak further, his thoughts racing as he glanced nervously at the other people in the hall. His lips parted, but no sound came. Finally, he exhaled deeply and looked directly at Purbright. There's a legend. One of the first families of this town, the Stallworths, they were involved in something dark. Purbright's expression remained unchanged, but inside, a flicker of curiosity was sparked. He'd heard of the Stallworths. Their name still lingered in the town's history, though mostly in hushed tones and vague mentions. Go on, Purbright urged. Morrow hesitated before continuing, his voice lowering even further. They practiced something occult, you could say. It wasn't just superstition. They believed in things, in ways to communicate with the dead, to gain knowledge from beyond. And they hid their rituals, buried them right there, in the churchyard. Purbright absorbed this new information carefully, his mind already working through the possibilities. Occult practices, rituals, those things weren't usually associated with small towns like Flaxborough, but this wasn't just any town. This was a place steeped in history, and history, Purbright had learned over the years, had a way of rising up when least expected. Do you know what they were after? Purbright asked, his voice steady but insistent. Morrow looked away, his hands now gripping the edge of the window ledge as though it were his lifeline. Power, knowledge, control. They thought that by connecting with the dead, they could tap into something that no one else had access to, something hidden, ancient. They made a pact, you see, a pact with the wrong kind of forces. Purbright's mind spun as he processed this. The Stallworths, it seemed, had been more than just a wealthy family with a curious reputation. They had been involved in something far darker, something that had remained buried in the town's past, hidden away under layers of normality. And what happened to them? Purbright asked, his voice tight with the weight of his curiosity. They vanished, Morrow replied, his voice barely a whisper. Just like that. Gone, without a trace. Some say they were taken, others say they were consumed by what they had summoned. But whatever happened, it was enough to frighten the rest of us, to make sure we forgot. Purbright stood still, his gaze fixed on Mr. Morrow, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The strange events, the girl's cryptic words, the whine, the scream, it was all starting to make sense. The Stallworths had dabbled in the supernatural, and their actions had left scars on the town that even time couldn't erase. So the graveyard, Purbright said slowly, the old tombstones, they aren't just resting places, they're something else. Mr. Morrow nodded grimly. That's right. They're the remnants of what was once a powerful, dangerous practice, and it hasn't been forgotten, not completely. It's still there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting. Purbright's mind was racing. This wasn't just a simple murder, or a trivial crime. This was something much bigger. The girl, the scream, the whine, these were not random events. They were part of a much larger story, one that had its roots in the town's history, and was now surfacing again like a long dormant beast stirring from sleep. I need to see the graveyard, Purbright said, his tone final. I need to see the site for myself. Morrow hesitated for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. I'll take you, but you won't find what you expect. Purbright's eyes narrowed. He wasn't looking for the obvious answers anymore. He had a feeling that whatever awaited him in that churchyard would reveal the town's hidden secrets. But it would also bring him closer to the truth about the girl, the old man, and the dark forces that seemed to be pulling the strings. I'm ready, Purbright said quietly, his voice steady. Let's go. The two of them left the hall, the weight of their shared knowledge settling over them like a shroud. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the horizon, leaving only the faintest sliver of light as they made their way toward the churchyard. The air was thick with anticipation, every step drawing Purbright closer to something that would change everything. The churchyard loomed before them, its ancient stones casting long shadows. It was as if the ground itself had a secret, one it had been waiting centuries to reveal. Purbright's pulse quickened as he approached the iron gate, its hinges creaking under the weight of history. Inside, the gravestones stood like silent sentinels, each one a marker of something long forgotten. But Purbright knew now that the truth was buried here, beneath the cracked stones, beneath the twisted roots of ancient trees. And whatever it was, whatever had been hidden here for so long, it was waiting for him to find it. Mr. Morrow led the way, his steps slow, measured, as though he was walking through a place of memory, not a place of the present. Purbright followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the gravestones, looking for something, anything, that would give him a clue. They stopped at a particularly weathered stone, its inscription barely legible, its surface worn smooth by centuries, shy of wind and rain. Morrow placed his hand on the stone, his fingers trembling slightly. "This is it," Morrow said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where they made the pact." Purbright stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the stone. Something about it felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight that seemed to press down on him, making it hard to breathe. He ran his hand over the stone's surface, feeling the coldness seep into his skin. It was like touching something ancient, something that had not been meant to be disturbed. "I need you to tell me everything you know, Mr. Morrow," Purbright said, his voice low but firm. "Everything." Morrow looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "You'll wish you hadn't asked, Inspector," he said quietly. "But once you've started down this path, there's no turning back." Purbright didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of the truth." For a long moment Morrow said nothing. Then he nodded, his voice barely a whisper as he began to tell the rest of the story of the Stallworths, the pact, and the terrible price they had paid. The wind had picked up as Purbright and Mr. Morrow stood together in the churchyard, the ancient gravestones casting long shadows under the dimming sky. The quiet around them felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath, waiting for the next part of the story to unfold. Purbright's hand rested lightly on the weathered stone, his fingers tracing the rough surface where the faintest traces of old carving still lingered, hidden beneath centuries of wear and weather. Morrow, standing beside him, was visibly uneasy, his eyes darting around the churchyard, as though expecting something, someone, to appear at any moment. His usual stoicism had fractured, and Purbright could sense the fear in the old man, the weight of secrets pressing down on him. It was clear that this place, this tombstone, had been a site of more than just burial. It was a place where something ancient and terrible had been sealed away, locked in the past, waiting for someone to unlock it. Morrow's voice, when it came, was barely audible. "The Stallworths, when they made the pact, they didn't just seek knowledge, they sought power. They believed they could control the forces that govern life and death, that they could summon something far beyond their understanding. They were warned, you see. But greed is a powerful thing." Purbright listened intently, his mind processing the words, each one heavier than the last. The Stallworths had been consumed by their ambition, and now, decades later, it seemed their dark bargain was beginning to echo through the town once more. "They weren't the first," Morrow continued, his eyes locked on the grave. "There were others before them, families who dabbled in forbidden knowledge. But the Stallworths, they were the ones who took it too far. They didn't just summon spirits, they sought to control them, to make them do their bidding. But it wasn't spirits they summoned, it was something else." The air seemed to grow colder as Morrow spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It was something that shouldn't have been brought into this world. They thought they could bind it to the earth, trap it here, control it. But they failed, and when they failed, they paid the price." Purbright's mind was racing now, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. The girl, the wine, the scream, these weren't random occurrences. They were the signs of something trying to break free, something that had been sealed away long ago. The pact, the forces, the Stallworths had meddled with, were no longer contained. They were leaking into the present, reaching out to find those who would listen. "Why hasn't it been stopped?" Purbright asked, his voice tight with the implications of Morrow's words. Morrow's gaze dropped to the ground, his face etched with sorrow. Because it's too dangerous to face. The Stolworths, they didn't just make a pact with the dead, Inspector. They made a pact with something far worse. And now that thing is trying to find a way back. It wants to finish what they started. Purbright felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about the Stolworths anymore. This was something larger, something more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The forces at work here were not just supernatural. They were ancient, primal. And whatever had been unleashed, it was not something that could be easily put back. You said it's been sealed away, Purbright said, his tone insistent. Where? How? Morrow's eyes flicked toward the far corner of the churchyard, where a small overgrown path led into the dense woods that bordered the graveyard. There's a crypt, he said, his voice low, almost reverential. It's hidden, buried beneath the earth. The Stolworths tried to lock it away there. But it's not just a tomb, Inspector. It's a prison for something that can never be free. Purbright's heart raced as he processed Morrow's words. The crypt, the prison, it all pointed in one direction. The girl, the wine, the strange events, everything was leading him toward that hidden place. But even now, as he stood on the edge of the mystery, he knew that whatever waited in that crypt was far beyond anything he had encountered before. The town's secrets were deeper, darker, and far more dangerous than he had ever realized. We need to find it, Purbright said, his voice firm. We need to go to the crypt. Morrow hesitated, his face drawn with fear. You don't understand, Inspector. It's not that simple. The crypt is... it's cursed. No one has ever come back from there. No one. But Purbright wasn't listening to him anymore. He had to see it for himself. He had to understand what had been buried there all those years ago. There was a truth hidden in the earth, and Purbright wasn't going to stop until he uncovered it. I don't have the luxury of hesitation, Mr. Morrow, Purbright said, his tone cold and unwavering. We need to go now. Morrow looked as though he might protest, but the resolute look in Purbright's eyes silenced him. The old man gave a reluctant nod, and together they made their way toward the hidden path that led into the woods. The trees grew denser as they walked, the light of the setting sun barely filtering through the thick canopy above them. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the further they went, the heavier the silence became. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing, and there, half hidden by ivy and overgrown roots, stood a small crumbling stone structure. It was the crypt Morrow had spoken of, its once pristine surface now worn and weathered, the stone darkened with age. The door was partially ajar, and inside the shadows seemed to stretch long and deep as though something waited within. Purbright stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. He reached for the door, but Morrow grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong for such an old man. Inspector, don't, Morrow warned, his voice strained with desperation. You don't know what you're dealing with. But Purbright shook him off, his gaze fixed on the darkened interior of the crypt. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, he said quietly. And I'm going in. With a final, resigned sigh, Morrow stepped back, his face pale as he watched Purbright push open the heavy stone door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. Purbright entered, his footsteps cautious but determined. The inside of the crypt was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rot. The stone walls were covered in moss and lichen, and the floor was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and debris. At the far end of the room there was a raised altar-like platform, and on it a large darkened object lay covered in cloth. Purbright moved closer, his breath shallow. He reached for the cloth, his hands trembling as he pulled it away. Underneath, there was a stone slab, carved with symbols and markings that Purbright didn't recognize, but it was the thing lying atop the slab that made his blood run cold. It was an ancient, twisted figure, its shape both human and monstrous. Its eyes, empty and hollow, stared up at Purbright with an intensity that seemed to burn through him. Purbright took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. He had found it, the thing the Stolworths had sought to control, and it was still here, waiting. Suddenly the ground beneath him shifted, the air growing heavy. Purbright's breath quickened as a low, rumbling sound began to vibrate through the crypt, as if something deep within the earth had awakened. And then, just as suddenly, the crypt door slammed shut behind him. Purbright spun around, his pulse racing. The shadows in the crypt seemed to grow darker, thicker, as though they were closing in on him. There was no way out now. He had come to uncover the truth. But in doing so, he had unleashed something far worse than he could ever have imagined. Purbright's breath caught in his throat as the crypt door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the damp stone walls. The shadows in the room seemed to twist and shift, the cold air growing denser with every passing second. His heart raced, the pulse pounding in his ears as he glanced around, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The stone slab, its eerie surface, marked with ancient symbols, stood like a silent sentinel in front of him, but it was the twisted figure atop it that demanded his attention. The creature, if it could be called that, lay sprawled across the stone, its form both grotesque and alien. It was humanoid in shape, but with limbs too long and a body that seemed to ripple unnaturally beneath the cloth. The hollow, empty eyes seemed to follow Purbright's every move, even though the thing had not moved an inch. It was as though it was waiting for something. Purbright took a cautious step forward, his feet sinking into the uneven floor with a soft scrape. The room felt smaller now, as if the air itself had thickened with dread. He reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing against the edge of the slab, feeling the cold stone beneath his touch. A faint tremor ran through him, not from fear but from a deep, gut-wrenching certainty. This place, this crypt, was more than just a tomb. It was a prison. The thing trapped here was no mere corpse, no relic of the past. It was alive in a way that defied understanding. His mind raced back to Mr. Morrow's words. They thought they could control it. They thought they could make it obey. But they were wrong. Purbright's pulse quickened as the truth began to take shape in his mind. The Stallworths hadn't simply dabbled in dark rituals. They had made contact with something that was never meant to be touched. And now the seal that had kept it locked away for so long had begun to break. This wasn't just a matter of superstition or hidden knowledge. This was a force, a presence, that had been waiting for centuries to break free. The shadows in the crypt seemed to deepen, swirling around the edges of the room, their tendrils creeping closer to him. Purbright stepped back instinctively, his eyes fixed on the figure. He could feel the weight of its gaze pressing into him, but it was the low, pulsing hum that filled the air that truly unsettled him. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration, a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to reverberate in his very bones. It was as if the crypt itself was alive, reacting to his presence. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet trembled. It wasn't a simple shift, but a deep, groaning motion, like the earth itself was being unsettled from below. Purbright stumbled, his hands reaching out for balance as the room seemed to spin around him. The hum grew louder, and the shadows around him thickened, swirling in a pattern that was almost deliberate. It was as though something was waking up, something that had been dormant for far too long. Purbright's mind raced as he fought to steady himself, his instincts screaming at him to get out. But he knew deep down that he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without understanding what had been unleashed. He took a step forward, his gaze locked on the creature before him. The air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy, and the symbols carved into the stone beneath it began to glow, faintly, their edges pulsing with an eerie light. The rumbling beneath him grew louder, shaking the very foundations of the crypt. The walls seemed to contract, the ceiling lowering, as though the room was shrinking, closing in on him. His breath caught in his chest as the creature's limbs twitched just slightly, as if it were waking from a deep ancient slumber. The shadows seemed to draw tighter around Purbright, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he felt as though the very darkness itself was consuming him, pulling him into its depths. His thoughts flashed to the girl, to the wine, and to the scream that had echoed through the town. She had been part of this, her connection to the wine, her encounter with the man in the graveyard. It was all leading back to this moment, this crypt. She had been a key, a catalyst, perhaps unknowingly so, but a key nonetheless. The ritual that the Stallworths had set in motion had never been meant to end. They had sealed it away, yes, but they had also left it incomplete. And now, centuries later, the forces they had tried to control were beginning to break free. Purbright's mind raced as the crypt seemed to shake with growing intensity. He could hear something now, soft, whispering voices, as if the walls themselves were speaking. It was in a language he couldn't understand, but the tone, the cadence was unmistakable. It was a call, a beckoning. The thing that had been trapped here was trying to reach him, trying to make contact. "Who are you?" Purbright demanded, his voice rough, strained by the growing pressure in the air. His hand gripped the stone slab tighter, as if it could anchor him to the reality he knew. "What do you want?" For a moment there was silence. The rumbling ceased, the hum died away, and the air grew still, as if holding its breath. Then, from the darkness, came a voice, low, guttural, and ancient. The words were not words at all, but sounds, in a language so old, so twisted, that Purbright couldn't even comprehend them. Yet, in the deep recesses of his mind, he felt them, felt their meaning. They weren't meant for him, not directly, but for the town, for Flaxborough itself. A message. Purbright felt his heart race as the shadows swirled around him, tightening their grip. The creature's eyes, empty and hollow, glowed faintly, and in that moment Purbright realized something terrifying. The creature wasn't just waiting for release. It was speaking, and it had a message for him, a message that once spoken could not be unsaid. The thing that had been buried was beginning to stir, and its whispers were meant for him. He couldn't see the connection yet, but he knew, deep within, that the girl's strange behavior, her connection to the wine and the ritual that had been attempted long ago, were all tied together. The ancient force trapped here was reaching out, trying to finish what had been started. Suddenly, the crypt door burst open, light flooding into the room, and Purbright staggered back, squinting into the brightness. He could barely make out a figure standing in the doorway, but his mind barely registered the shape before a voice called out to him, "Inspector! Get out of there!" It was Mr. Morrow. His face was pale, his voice trembling with urgency. But it was the figure behind him that caught Purbright's attention. Standing just outside the door was the girl. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide, and in her hand she clutched the wine glass. The world seemed to tilt as the shadows in the crypt recoiled, as though the light had wounded them. The rumbling faded, the whispering voices dying away, leaving only the oppressive silence. Purbright's breath came in short gasps as he stared at the girl, his heart pounding. "You," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're the key, aren't you?" The girl didn't answer, but her gaze seemed to lock with his, her expression both fearful and resigned. And as she stepped into the crypt, holding the wineglass up, the shadows recoiled, leaving Purbright with a chilling thought. The pact had not only been with the dead, it had been with her. Purbright's mind raced as the girl stepped further into the crypt, the door creaking ominously behind her. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air seemed to thicken, the oppressive stillness of the room growing heavier. The shadows, once swirling with an almost malevolent energy, now stilled, as though they were waiting for her to make the next move. Purbright's breath caught in his throat. He had known deep down that the girl was more than just a bystander in this unfolding mystery. But now, standing in the crypt with her, he could feel the weight of her presence. She was not simply involved. She was integral to the darkness that had taken root in Flaxborough. The wine, the old man's cryptic words, her strange behavior, it all pointed back to her. Purbright's voice faltered as he tried to piece it all together. "You're the one who's been holding it at bay, aren't you? The thing in the graveyard, the pact." The girl's eyes, wide and unblinking, met his. For a moment there was no expression in her face, nothing that could be interpreted, just an emptiness. Then slowly her lips parted, and her voice came in a soft whisper that seemed to echo around the crypt despite the stillness. "I'm not what you think I am." The words hung in the air like a shroud, and for a long moment, Purbright didn't move. He was still trying to process what she had said, his thoughts tangling in knots. What was she implying? That she wasn't human? That she was merely a vessel for something much darker? Behind him, Mr. Morrow shifted uneasily, his eyes darting from the girl to Purbright, but he said nothing. Purbright could feel the weight of the old man's fear pressing down on him, and he understood now that Morrow's knowledge had only scratched the surface. The real story, the truth, lay with the girl, just as it had always been. "Then who are you?" Purbright asked, his voice low but firm, his gaze never leaving hers. "What are you?" The girl took a step forward, her eyes still fixed on Purbright as though he were the only thing in the room. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were carefully choosing each step, each word. Her hand still gripped the wine-glass, but now it trembled, the liquid inside swaying with the slightest movement. "I was born into this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family, my blood, has always been part of the Stallworths. And the pact, it's part of me too. It was never meant to be broken, but the Stallworths couldn't control it. They thought they could lock it away, but the pact has never really been sealed. Not completely." Purbright's mind reeled as he processed the words. The Stallworths, the pact, the girl, everything he had uncovered so far had led him here to this moment, to this girl who was somehow both part of the town's dark history and its future. "And you," Purbright began, his thoughts still, catching up to her confession. "You're tied to it, to the thing in the crypt, the power it holds." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I was chosen. My family has always served as the intermediary, the keeper, if you will. But the thing that was locked away, it doesn't want to be locked away anymore. It's been waiting for centuries, feeding off the fear, the darkness. Then and I am the last link in the chain." Purbright took a step back, his mind spinning. The girl wasn't just a victim of some ancient pact. She was its key. The wine, the rituals, her strange behavior. It was all tied to her, to what she was meant to do. The truth, as unsettling as it was, began to unfold before him. The pact had never truly been broken. It had merely lain dormant, waiting for someone to finish what the Stallworths had started. "What happens now?" Purbright asked, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the situation. "What do you want from me?" For a brief moment the girl's expression softened, her face almost childlike in its vulnerability. "I don't want anything," she whispered. "I can't stop it. It's already begun. The thing, and it's starting to wake up. It's calling to me, calling to all of us." Purbright's stomach tightened. He had suspected it for some time, but hearing it spoken aloud made the situation all the more terrifying. The thing that had been buried here, locked away by the Stallworths, was stirring. It wasn't just a matter of history. It was a matter of survival. The pact, the crypt, the girl, all of it was part of something far larger, something far more dangerous than anything Purbright had imagined when he first stepped into Flaxborough. "Tell me what you know," Purbright said, his voice urgent now. "Everything." The girl hesitated for a moment before answering, her eyes darkening. "It's not just about the town. It never was. The Stallworths thought they could control it, but they didn't understand the true nature of the pact. It's bigger than them. It's bigger than me." Purbright felt a chill run through him. "What are you saying?" "The pact. It's tied to this town, yes, but it's tied to something much older," she continued, her voice distant as though she were speaking from somewhere far away. "The thing in the crypt, it's not just a spirit. It's something more, something that existed long before the Stallworths, before the town. And when the seal was broken, it wasn't just released. It was invited. Invited back into this world." Purbright's blood ran cold as he processed her words. This wasn't just about the Stallworths' greed or ambition. It wasn't even about the pact itself. The thing that had been sealed away wasn't a ghost or some other worldly spirit. It was something older, something that had been around long before the town had even existed. And it had been waiting patiently for someone to open the door. "There's a way to stop it," the girl said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resignation. "But it will cost you. It will cost all of us." Purbright shook his head, his mind struggling to keep up with the magnitude of what she was saying. "What do you mean? How do we stop it?" "The pact, it has to be completed," she said softly. "But the final piece, the last act, can't be done by just anyone. It has to be someone who is part of it. Someone like me." Purbright stared at her, his heart hammering in his chest. She was the key. But what was the cost? What did she mean by completing the pact? You don't understand, she whispered. Once the pact is completed, once it's finished, it will be free. But it won't stop. It won't just be in this town. It will spread. The darkness will spread. Purbright took a step toward her, his mind made up. He didn't know how he would stop it, or what the girl's role in it all truly was, but he couldn't allow it to continue. Not now that he understood the stakes. We need to finish it then, he said quietly, his voice resolute. So we need to stop it, and we'll do it together. The girl met his gaze, her eyes filled with something between fear and determination. For a moment they stood in the crypt, surrounded by the weight of the past, the shadows closing in around them. The pact, the creature, the ancient forces at play, it was all leading them here to this moment. And Purbright knew deep down that whatever happened next would change everything, but it was too late to turn back. The air inside the crypt felt thicker, heavier than it had moments before. The low hum of energy still lingered, vibrating the very walls, as though the crypt itself was alive. Purbright stood frozen, his mind working furiously to make sense of the girl's words. The pact, the ancient darkness, the thing waiting in the crypt. His pulse raced as he considered the magnitude of what they were facing. They were no longer just dealing with a small-town mystery. This was a force older than Flaxborough itself, a force that had been waiting patiently for centuries. The girl stood in front of him, her eyes still fixed on him, but there was a subtle change in her expression, a quiet understanding that had not been there before. She had been the key all along, whether she had realized it or not. The wine, the strange behavior, the unsettling connection to the forces beneath the earth, it had all led to this moment, and now, with the weight of the town's dark history pressing down on them, they had to make a choice. Purbright stepped forward, his mind clearing as he focused on the task at hand. We need to finish it, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Whatever it takes. The girl's expression softened, but there was a faint sadness in her eyes as if she understood the cost. You don't know what you're asking, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. To finish the pact, to complete it, it's not just about stopping it, it's about binding it for good, and the price, it will be more than either of us can bear. Purbright didn't hesitate. He had seen too much, understood too much to turn back now. We don't have a choice. The town is already in its grip. If we don't finish this, if we don't complete the pact, it will only get worse. The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, but the rumbling sound from deep within the crypt cut her off. It wasn't the rumbling of the earth shifting, but something more primal, more urgent. The shadows seemed to recoil as if reacting to the sound, a low growl emanating from the darkness, deep and guttural. The girl's face went pale as she stepped back. It's waking up, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It knows we're here. It's been waiting. Purbright turned to face the darkness, the cold stone of the crypt suddenly feeling less like a safe barrier and more like a prison. He could feel the presence, a palpable weight that seemed to press down on his chest. The creature, the force that had been sealed here, was waking, and it was hungry. We don't have much time, Purbright said, his voice low and urgent. Whatever needs to be done, it has to happen now. The girl nodded, her hand trembling, as she held the wineglass before her, the liquid swirling inside like some ancient elixir. You don't understand. It's not just about the ritual. It's about who has the power to bind it. Purbright's eyes narrowed. And who has that power? Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Then, after a long moment of silence, she spoke, her voice breaking. I do. Purbright blinked, unsure whether he had heard her correctly. You? He repeated, his voice rising slightly. But you said, I was born for this, she interrupted, her voice shaky but resolute. I'm the last of the Stalworths, the last of the line that made the pact. I'm the only one who can finish it. The truth of her words settled heavily between them. She wasn't just a victim of the pact. She was its final instrument. She had been born into it, shaped by it, and now it was her burden to carry, whether she was ready for it or not. Purbright stepped closer, his mind racing. Then tell me what we need to do. I'll help you, whatever it takes. The girl shook her head slowly, the sorrow in her eyes deepening. No, it's something I have to do alone. You can't help me. The cost— She trailed off as if the words were too painful to say. It has to be me. It was always meant to be me. Purbright's throat tightened as he realized the full weight of her words. She wasn't just the key, she was the sacrifice. The pact could only be completed by one who was both bound to it and capable of binding it back. She was the last piece, the only one who could end it. But at what cost? I can't let you do this, Purbright said, his voice quiet but forceful. There has to be another way. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. There is no other way, don't you see? The pact was never about the town, or even about me. It was about the thing in the crypt. It wanted to be free, and it's been waiting for me, for someone like me, and now it's too late to turn back. Purbright's breath caught in his chest as the truth of her words sunk in. There was no way out. The pact had been made long before either of them had been born, and now the final act had to be completed. The girl was the key, and in completing the pact she would either bind the creature or set it free, forever. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the crypt, and Purbright could feel the air change, the weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on him. He had no choice but to trust her now, to believe that whatever she had to do would be— Snuff, do it, Purbright said softly, stepping back, his eyes never leaving hers. I'll be here. I won't let it take you. The girl nodded, the wineglass now held firmly in her hand, the liquid inside shimmering faintly in the dim light. She stepped forward, toward the stone slab, and with each step, the air around her seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening as if they were alive, closing in. She stopped before the slab, her eyes lifting to the twisted figure lying atop it, its hollow eyes staring back at her, waiting. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she poured the wine onto the stone. The liquid pooled around the base of the figure, and the shadows seemed to writhe in response. Purbright watched, his heart pounding, as the rumbling grew louder, more frantic, as if the very earth was trying to expel what had been trapped beneath it. The walls of the crypt groaned, the air crackling with energy. The girl's hand clenched around the wineglass, her knuckles white as she murmured something under her breath, words in a language Purbright couldn't understand, but which seemed to reverberate deep in his chest. The shadows recoiled, and, for a moment, everything went still. Then slowly the figure on the slab began to move, its limbs shifting, twisting, and the shadows gathered around it, thickening into a form. The crypt seemed to breathe as the creature began to rise, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. Purbright's heart raced. The creature was waking, but the girl didn't flinch. Her voice grew louder, more confident, as she spoke the words of the ritual, words that Purbright could feel in the very marrow of his bones, words that were calling something back to the depths from which it had come. The creature's form grew clearer, more defined, and Purbright could feel the power of it, a force so ancient, so primal, that it seemed to wrap around him, pressing in, suffocating him. And then, as the last of the words left the girl's lips, the air in the crypt froze. For a moment everything was silent, and then, with a sound that tore through the very fabric of the crypt, the creature screamed. Purbright's vision blurred as the walls of the crypt seemed to shudder, as if the very earth was trying to reject the thing that had once been sealed away. But in that moment Purbright knew. The pact had been completed. The girl had done it. She had bound it. But at what cost? The scream echoed through the crypt, a sound so guttural, so primal, that it felt as though the very walls of the room were trembling with it. Purbright stood motionless, his heart hammering in his chest, watching as the shadows around them seemed to writhe, gathering in response to the force that was being released. The girl, standing at the center of it all, was still clutching the wineglass, her face pale but determined, her voice now silent but her presence powerful. For a moment everything seemed to freeze. The air was thick with energy, heavy with the weight of what had just been set in motion. The creature, its twisted form now fully revealed, hovered in the center of the crypt, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. Its body was both human and monstrous, a grotesque fusion of shapes that seemed to defy nature itself. Its limbs, too long and too angular, twitched and jerked in the dim light, as though it was struggling to adjust to its newfound freedom. Purbright could feel it then, the pulse of energy radiating from the creature, a dark, suffocating force that wrapped around him like a vice. It was as if the crypt itself had become alive, breathing with the same unnatural rhythm. The shadows in the room grew deeper, swirling around the edges, and he could feel them pulling at him, trying to drag him into the darkness. But the girl, she stood resolute, her body still as a statue. Her face was set in an expression of grim determination, her gaze fixed on the creature before her. The words of the ritual had stopped, and yet the room seemed to hum with their power, as if the ritual was still unfolding in the very air around them. Purbright took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving the creature that was now fully awake, its form pulsating with the energy of the pact. "You did it," he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "You stopped it." The girl didn't answer at first, her eyes still locked on the creature. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The air between them was thick with the remnants of the ritual, the consequences of their actions, and the silence that followed the scream was almost deafening. The shadows in the room continued to twist, and Purbright could feel the weight of the creature's gaze on him, even though it was no longer focused on him directly. "I did what I had to do," the girl said finally, her voice barely audible over the low hum that still filled the crypt. "But the cost, it's more than I thought." Purbright's gaze flicked to her, confusion creeping into his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with worry. "You've done it. The pact is complete, it's bound." The girl shook her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the creature as it began to stir, its limbs twitching with a life of their own. "It's not over, Purbright. The pact, it was never meant to be completed this way, not like this." Purbright felt a cold chill run down his spine as her words sank in. "What are you saying? It's not over?" "We've bound it. You've bound it." The girl turned to face him then, her expression hauntingly calm, but her eyes were filled with a sadness that made Purbright's stomach twist. "I thought it would stop it. I thought by completing the ritual, by doing what I was born to do, it would end. But now I see. It wasn't the creature we needed to bind. It was me." For a long moment, Purbright didn't understand. He stared at her, his mind struggling to piece together what she was saying. The air in the crypt was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, pulling at them, suffocating. The light. The creature, its eyes now fully alive, began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if testing its new form, its new freedom. The girl's voice trembled as she spoke again, this time with a clarity that made Purbright's heart sink. "I wasn't just the key to the pact. I was meant to be the vessel, the creature. It didn't just want to be freed, it needed me. It needed me to finish the pact and complete its release. But in doing so, it's not bound anymore. It's inside. Me. It's inside all of us." Purbright's eyes widened as the weight of her words hit him. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's inside you? You've become the vessel for it?" She nodded slowly, her face drained of color. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could be the one to stop it, but now I see. The creature wasn't trapped in the crypt. It was trapped inside me, the last of the Stalworths, and now it's free, but it's not just free from the crypt. It's free inside me, inside anyone who carries the bloodline." Purbright took a step forward, his mind racing, trying to process everything she had just revealed. "So, it's not over. It's not bound. It's still here, and it's inside you." The girl's face twisted in pain as she took a step back, her hand clutching the wineglass tighter. "I can feel it," she said, her voice strained, almost panicked. "It's in my mind, in my body. It's not just inside me. It's inside everyone, with the bloodline. The pact was supposed to be finished, but I was never meant to finish it. It was never meant to end this way. It was meant to take control, to take over, to spread." The crypt seemed to grow colder as the realization settled in. The creature, the force that had been sealed away, wasn't just free. It was free within. The girl, within the bloodline of the Stalworths. It was spreading, infecting, slowly seeping into anyone connected to it. The cost of completing the pact wasn't just about freeing the creature. It was about unleashing it completely, giving sight access to every soul tied to the town's cursed history. Purbright stepped closer to her, his heart pounding. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. "There has to be something we can do." The girl shook her head, her expression filled with sorrow. "I thought I could stop it. I thought the ritual would work. But it's too late. It's already begun. The bloodline. It's the key to everything, and now it's starting to spread." Purbright's mind was racing, every thought fighting for space as he tried to process the enormity of what had just happened. The pact, the creature, the girl, all of it was part of something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. The creature had not been contained. It had been unleashed, not just into the crypt, but into the very blood of the town. "We have to contain it," Purbright said, his voice shaking with the weight of his resolve. "There must be a way to reverse it, to seal it away again." The girl's eyes flickered with a momentary spark of hope before she lowered her gaze. "There's no sealing it back, Purbright," she whispered. "The only way to stop it is to sever the bloodline completely. But that's not something I can do. It's not something anyone can do. The pact was never just about the creature. It was about us." Purbright stood still, feeling the weight of her words crushing him. The very blood that connected them to the past was the key to everything, and now that connection, that curse, was threatening to destroy them all. "We're running out of time," Purbright said urgently, stepping back toward the crypt's entrance. The shadows around them seemed to pulse, as though they were responding to his words, growing thicker, darker. The creature was still inside, still pushing against the boundaries of its new form, and Purbright could feel its power beginning to surge again. The girl reached out, her hand trembling, as if trying to stop him. "It's already here," she said softly, her voice filled with a haunting finality. "And there's no way to stop it. We've opened the door, Purbright. And now, there's no closing it." Purbright turned to face her one last time, his heart heavy, with the realization that the town of Flaxborough, the world they knew, had changed forever. The pact had not ended as it was meant to. It had only begun. And in that beginning there was no turning back. The crypt was no longer just a tomb. It had become the battleground for something far older, far more terrifying than Purbright had ever imagined. The air was thick with dread, pulsing with the echoes of a long-buried darkness that had awakened. And now, as the girl's words reverberated in his mind, Purbright understood the full weight of the situation. There was no turning back. The creature, the pact, the bloodline, it was all connected, and it had spread beyond the crypt, beyond the girl, and now it had taken root in the very heart of Flaxborough. Purbright glanced at her one last time. She was standing still, her expression a mixture of resignation and sorrow, the weight of what she had just realized too much for her to bear alone. The town had been drawn into this ancient, cursed ritual, and it wasn't just about the creature anymore. It was about the bloodline that had carried this curse forward, century after century, and now it was reaching out, pulling in the unsuspecting. The shadows in the crypt seemed to shift as though alive, pressing closer, tighter. The air had grown colder, the oppressive presence of the creature filling the room, seeping through the walls, through the very floor. Purbright could feel it, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe, as if the crypt itself were reacting to the girl's final words, to the power she had just unleashed. "We have to stop it," Purbright said again, though he knew, deep down, that it wasn't about stopping it anymore. It was about containing it, understanding it, and, if they were lucky, surviving it. The girl took a deep breath, her eyes still locked on the creature, her fingers twitching around the wine. Glass she still held. The liquid inside had long since stopped moving, but there was something in her hand now, something that seemed to pulse with the same unnatural energy that filled the room. Her silence was the loudest sound in the crypt as she weighed what was left of their options. "I don't think we can stop it," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the oppressive atmosphere. "But we can at least try to control it, contain it, seal it away, or we risk everything." Purbright nodded slowly, his mind working furiously to process what had just been revealed. The girl wasn't just a vessel. She was the key to something larger than the pact, something that had been set into motion long before they arrived. Her bloodline, her connection to the creature, was the bridge between their world and whatever dark force had been locked away for centuries. And now, that force was free. But it wasn't just its physical form they needed to worry about. It was its influence, its reach, and its hunger. "You said the pact was never meant to end this way," Purbright said, his voice tight with urgency. "What did you mean? What did the Stallworths do wrong?" The girl's gaze shifted from the creature to him, her expression hardening. "They thought they could control it. They believed that by binding it in the crypt, they could lock it away forever. But what they didn't understand was that the creature wasn't just bound by physical walls. It was bound by the bloodline, by the very essence of the pact. And when they tried to seal it, they created a tether, an unbreakable bond. The creature's essence is part of me, part of anyone who carries the bloodline. I didn't realize it fully until now. But when I poured the wine, when I completed the ritual, I didn't just free it. I gave it power over me." Purbright felt a chill run through him. The creature, the force they had been trying to control, had been freed not just into the world, but into the girl's very soul. The darkness wasn't just an external threat. It was a part of her, twisting and clawing to take control. "What do we do now?" Purbright asked, the weight of the question sinking into the pit of his stomach. The girl's eyes flickered briefly, a moment of doubt crossing her features, before she stood straighter, as if summoning the last reserves of her strength. "We have to go back to the crypt. We need to complete the last part of the ritual, the one the Stallworths left unfinished. The thing in the crypt. It's not just a creature, it's a vessel, a doorway. If I don't sever the link, if we don't complete the ritual fully, it will be free to spread. Not just here, not just in this town, but across the land. It will corrupt everything in its path." Purbright's breath caught in his chest. The urgency in her voice, the fear in her eyes, it was real. This wasn't just a matter of a cursed town. The creature's reach could span far beyond this graveyard, far beyond Flaxborough. It could take everything. And the girl, the last. Stallworth was the only one who could stop it. "Then we go," Purbright said firmly, his mind made up. He turned and walked toward the crypt door, pushing it open with a force he hadn't felt before. The air outside was cold, but the fresh breeze felt like a fleeting relief. The crypt, however, felt like a prison. It was the place where this nightmare had begun, and it would be the place where it had to end. The girl followed him, her steps slow but determined, and for a moment, the two of them stood outside the crypt, the darkness swirling around them like a storm waiting to break. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Purbright asked, his voice steady, though he knew that nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen. The girl nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. It's the only way. Together, they stepped back inside. The creature was waiting for them, its form now fully visible, a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and twisted flesh. It seemed to pulse with a hunger that filled the crypt, its eyes glowing with an intensity that sent a jolt of fear through Purbright's chest. The girl raised the wineglass, holding it high, her gaze fixed on the creature. She was trembling, but she didn't falter. "This is it," she whispered. Purbright stood back, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, though he knew it wouldn't help them against the creature. They weren't here to fight it. They were here to bind it. And whatever happened next, he would be there to make sure the girl didn't face it alone. The girl spoke the final words of the ritual, her voice a low murmur that reverberated through the crypt, shaking the very walls. The creature let out a low guttural sound like a growl, but it wasn't one of fury. It was a sound of recognition. The shadows seemed to swell, drawing in around the girl, and for a brief moment, Purbright saw the girl's eyes flash with an eerie light. Her body trembled, and the air in the crypt grew thick with an energy that felt like it was choking the life out of everything in the room. Then, in an instant, the energy shifted. The shadows recoiled, the creature's form flickering as if struggling to maintain its solid shape. The rumbling began again, but this time it was quieter, more controlled. The girl's hands trembled as the last of the ritual left her lips. There was a sudden, deafening silence. For a moment, nothing moved. The creature, the shadows, the air, all seemed to hold their breath, and then the creature, once so powerful, so overwhelming, began to dissipate. Its form twisted and shrank, the darkness lifting from the crypt. The shadows retreated, pulling, back like a tide, until there was nothing left but the faintest echo of a presence. Purbright exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing. But it wasn't over. Not yet. He turned to the girl, who was still standing, her body shaking with exhaustion. "It's over," she said softly, her voice weak but filled with a sense of finality. "It's sealed, but it's inside me. Always." Purbright reached out to her, his hand steady, his eyes filled with sympathy. "We'll find a way to end this," he said softly, "but not today. Today, we survive." The girl's eyes closed, and for the first time since they had entered the crypt, she allowed herself to rest. The weight of the ritual, the burden of the creature, seemed to lift, but it wasn't gone. Not completely. They had contained it, for now. But the price had been paid, and the town of Flaxborough would never be the same. Purbright looked around. The crypt one last time, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The creature had been bound, yes, but it was still there, inside them all, a whisper in the dark. And as they walked away from the crypt, leaving the shadows behind them, Purbright knew that whatever came next, it would be the end of something old and the beginning of something much worse.